Hello and welcome to the Car Care Nut channel, and welcome to a beautiful 2001 Toyota Camry. One of my favorite Camrys, and this one is in really pristine condition, just over 100,000 miles, no rust, or almost no rust. We'll take a look at it in a second here. But I wanted to talk to you something about Toyota suspension and the 5S engine, because this engine doesn't really get a lot of press on my channel, at least until now. This car has an owner that really loves the car, takes care of it, doesn't compromise on cost because he wants to keep this car for a long time. He brought it in for a slew of issues that we've had with it. We'll take care of most of them, and I'm going to show you some stuff. Let's start with the struts. This is a strut out of this car, and this is not so beautiful Gabriel strut. I mean, if we look at this strut, it's already super rusty, and if we look at the other one, you can already see the problem. I mean, this thing is already falling apart. Look at this. It's all rotten away and just disintegrating. These struts, you would think they are 5, 10 years old. Actually, this is a 2 to 3 year old strut. Look at this. I just want you to see this. It's just completely falling apart from rust. That just tells you the quality of this strut. But that's not why we're actually replacing them. Whoever did this job didn't, or maybe was not extremely familiar with Toyotas. And for you, I'm going to tell you what they did wrong here, but the main reason we're replacing these struts is this one is blown. And when I say blown, completely blown. I mean, if you look at this strut, you know, even though this is also no good, because I can compress it all the way down, it won't come up. But this one is okay. This will make a little bit of sound, but not terrible. But now watch this one. I'm going to remove this. Yeah, I can literally just, push it, it already comes down on its own because it leaked all the fluid that it has. You see a strut like this, this is done. This, you don't need to see it. You're gonna hear this one making all kinds of rumble when you go over bumps. This one will make a little bit of noise because this one still have fluid in it, but because it's a horrible aftermarket one, just, you compress it down, doesn't really come back up. This is also no good. But the problem with this one was, not only were the struts no good, the mounts are also not good. And the reason for that is, these are actually original mounts. The person that did these struts didn't replace the mounts. Most mechanics will look at this mount and be like, oh, looks fine. But if you knew these cars, they have a notorious problem with mounts making noise. This and the first generation Avalon, they were notorious for this. And also the second generation Avalon as well. So 1997 all the way to 2004 for the Avalons, you're gonna have this problem. On the Camrys, 97, even the previous ones, not as much, but 97 to 2001, you're gonna have problems with mounts. So every time you do something with the struts, replace the mounts. But on top of that, Toyota struts will have a bearing, the front ones will have a bearing that sits right here. On this particular car, it was actually installed upside down. So every time you make a turn, it makes all kinds of weird noises and scraping, and that's not good. But in addition to all this, there's something with the 5S motor that most people don't know about, and they skip, and you have this phantom, never stopping oil leak from the valve cover, or what people assume is the valve cover. Here's the valve cover gasket, and yes, they do love to leak on these. It's just the way it is. But there is a plug on the side that majority of people don't even know it exists. It's just a little rubber plug, nothing really special about it. And I want to show you where this plug is, because every time you do a valve cover, you need to replace this plug. Otherwise, it'll be leaking faster than what you started with. Let's go to the engine, and I'll show you where that plug is. So this is the beautiful 5S FE. One of the best engines Toyota made. Iron block, had very few problems, but as they get older, we're gonna have more problems, just the way it is. One of the main problems with this engine is oil leaks, and they never seem to stop, and some people just give up at some point. It's like, forget it, this is just gonna keep leaking oil forever. That's because they don't know the ins and outs of this engine. The valve covers, the first mistake that people do. So the valve cover on this doesn't have, you notice it doesn't have bolts on the side. It actually, the bolts, there's actually 4 nuts underneath the spark plug wire. If we pull this spark plug wire, you're gonna see this big nut right here. That's the nut that actually holds the valve cover in. And the mistake is, you tighten these 4 nuts. Yeah, you're gonna alternate and all that, and you're done, right? Wrong. Because you have so much force in the middle, not really much outside, they never really clamp well. You wanna torque them to spec always. When you're done, go back and torque them again. And again, and again. And you're gonna notice every time you finish torquing all 4, you go back, they already lost their torque. You gotta keep going until you get to a point where it stops losing its torque. Then you're done. But more importantly than that, it's gonna be a little hard to show you. And now we're gonna try, if Eros comes this side, right behind the coil, you can see at the edge, right there, that's the plug that I told you about. It's gonna be right here. Let's talk about what that plug is first. That plug is actually a distributor plug. Remember that the 5SFE, when it started life, it used to have a distributor, and that distributor sat exactly in the hole that plug is. So when they moved to this generation Camry in '97, they moved to waste spark. No longer do we have a distributor, so they put a plug in the hole. That plug is rubber, that plug gets brittle, gets old, starts leaking. Very common, and another common mistake is people take it off, put sealer around it, and put it back. Folks, this plug is a few bucks. Readily available, you can buy it, just replace it. So you're gonna take the valve cover, the very last cam cap has no cam going through it because that's where the distributor would have went. Just take that cam cap and the seal will come right with it, the plug. That's the #1 cause of leaks on these. In addition to that, when you do a timing belt, there's a little bit of a tricky thing that you gotta do. Not only are you gonna replace the cam seal and the crank seal, you're also gonna replace the oil pump O-ring and seal. So the oil pump comes off, has a big O-ring behind it, and then where the pulley for that oil pump, which is driven by the timing belt, it also has a seal behind it. These are the #1 causes of leaks to these. If you did all that and it's still leaking oil from the front of the engine side, there is a cover behind the oil pump. It's a front timing cover on these, probably this big. That also loves to leak on these, so there is your other source of leak. If you're doing a timing belt, the car is this old, just do all of them. Do that, do the valve cover, do everything at the same time. Let's go back to our parts collection because I want to show you one more thing. The spark plugs. So if you look at the spark plugs here, they're actually dual tip spark plugs, and they're platinum, they're not iridium, they're just regular platinum 30,000 mile interval on these. And the reason they are platinum is because this has a waste spark system. So basically what a waste spark is, 2 cylinders will always be firing at the same time, and then 2 other cylinders will be firing at the same time. Pretty interesting setup, old school, very inefficient, but hey, it was a lot more efficient than distributors at the time. So we of course have spark plug wires because the coils, we didn't have coil on plug. This is back in the olden days when we had, these wires used to connect to the distributor. Now they connect to the coils because this was kind of a retrofit. They retrofitted the 5S into the waste spark. So you only have 2 coils because they're going to be firing 2 cylinders all the time. Even if one cylinder is not really firing, it's still going to fire. So you have these plugs. But something about Toyota spark plug wires that you might want to know about. The original ones are beautiful. They have a date on them. If you look at the date on this one, it might be very, very difficult to see on camera. It does say 2001. Let's take a picture of this in case you can't see it in the video. But There is actually no interval of replacement for these. Just Toyota figured, we make them so well, and they do for the most time. But it gets a point where you're 20 years into it, and we're on the original ones, just replace them. They start deteriorating. You can test them, but the more times you take them off, put them back, you're putting too much load on these 20-year-old plastic wires. Replace them. And that's what we did in this Camry. Something else before we lift the car. This is a bump stop or a bumper. This sits on the strut, just like so. This basically prevents the mount from bottoming into the strut and destroying things. And if you notice on this one, it's like all disintegrated and gone, because this strut has been, because it has no, you're basically just standing on the spring, has been beaten by the car going up and down, bouncing. So when you see this destroyed, replace it. This is a very important piece, because you do not want to bottom out this strut without a bumper, because you actually start damaging things. Having said that, let's lift this beautiful Camry up. Let's take a look at a few things. Let's take a look underneath this Camry. And this is something I want you to do when you look at these. These can be great cars, but they could turn into nightmares if you buy the wrong one. The first thing is the exhaust on these. Loves to rot. I mean, if you look at this one, this is not a very rusty car, but look at this. It's just flaking away, and this joint, not gonna happen to separate it. This is an original muffler, which is interesting to see, because you're gonna see less and less of these in the rusty land. But something else we did to this car is a charcoal canister right up here. Not a bad job, but the reason we replaced this charcoal canister is a common problem with these. So there is a valve right here. This valve loves to corrode, and you can no longer activate it. And you can, it's very simple diagnosis. You activate it with the scan tool. If it doesn't click or doesn't do anything, doesn't hold vacuum, it's no good. But some people will say, wait a second, you can buy this valve separate. And yes, you can. Why are we replacing the whole canister? I will ask you one question. Why do you think that valve failed? We've taken these valves apart before to see why they failed. You actually have debris in them, and the debris comes from the canister. So if you put a new valve, it'll work for a week or two, then it'll stop, it'll jam up again. Unless you want to, every 2 weeks, crawl under the car, pull the valve, clean it up, put it back. It's just not effective. Replace the canister when you have this valve off, because you're going to be going back and forth, back and forth. I am in the automotive repair. We don't really fix cars to have them come back every 2 weeks, so you replace the whole canister. And if you're for DIY, our DIY friends here, this canister will ask you to pull the subframe down. Don't do that, because this subframe, these bolts are notorious to break. You're going to drop the exhaust down. You're going to pull this shield right here, bend it a little bit, get the canister, and you can actually fish it out from here. Not the most simple job to do, but it's not impossible either. Something else that is notorious on these, the rear sway bar bushings. These bushings have a little bit of play, not enough to make noise yet, but they're gonna go. One thing also common, these bolts break and you have to drill them out, not a big deal. Rear sway bar links are common. Another thing with this one, the rear struts are also aftermarket. They've been replaced at the same time. This is something you deal with when the cars get older, but this is what you have to do. Don't go aftermarket on these. Don't go quick strut on these. They're very sensitive to this stuff. You're gonna keep having problem after problem after problem, and just, you'll get so upset at the end, and the car will not ride the same, and then you'll end up buying the originals, and you kind of double spend. So don't do that unless you absolutely have to. Another thing that is notorious for these is brake lines rotting out. These brake lines, you can see them very clearly here. These brake lines are not coated from the factory. They don't have the rubber coating on them. And in this particular one, they're very clean. This plastic is usually what cause them to rot. You have all kinds of salt or snow pile up here, and it's just sitting against the line. So if you have one of these, perhaps it's a good idea, take this cover off, spray these with undercoating. and you won't have issues with them. If it's already rusted, you might have to replace them. This is something very common with these. Something else, that the oil leak galore. Now, we haven't cleaned this one very well yet, but because I want you to see it on video before we're done with this car. This oil is all from that plug that I told you about. This is how bad they leak. I mean, you'll have oil all over the transmission, oil all over the engine, and this is how bad these get. And speaking of exhaust, flex pipe, and this one has already been welded. This is an aftermarket unit right here, all the way to here. Very common for this flex pipe to break. That's just the way they are. Something that's very interesting about this transmission, different than most Toyota transmissions. So in most Toyota transmissions, the differential and the transmission itself are one unit. You put the fluid you replace the fluid for the transmission, you've replaced the fluid for the differential as well. But in this, they're actually two separate. There's a transmission fluid and then there's differential fluid, even though they're the same unit. Here's the drain for that, here's the drain for the differential, the fill is right here, and then the drain for the transmission. They're two separate units, and you want to service them at the same time every 30,000 miles. Many people skip that last part. So here's what we did to the front suspension on this. Because of the strut situation, we put a new OEM strut, we put a new mount. The bearings were good, we just had to flip them upside down. And then we put front sway bar link, which are another common problem with these. I mean, when you look at this site, this is just a beautiful sight of the OEM parts, looking great over here. And then we go to this side, it's the same story. This is how this car should be. And you would not believe how well this thing drives now. It's unbelievable. This is a 21-year-old car. You drive it with these struts, it drives like a brand new car. No noise, you go over bumps, you feel nothing. You almost feel nothing. This is how these rode. But unfortunately, you see so many of them with aftermarket struts, quick struts, that they ride horrible. And people expect that, oh, it's an old car. Oh no, not this one. This is supposed to drive like a cloud. This is supposed to drive like a Lexus. It's very insulated, very nice. And people usually destroy them by putting aftermarket stuff and ruin the ride. So whenever you have problems with the ride, I have so many questions from viewers, from customers that come to the shop. Why does my Camry all of a sudden have noises and it just doesn't feel smooth anymore? I look, quick struts. Well, there you have it. Cheap is not always good. If you're keeping this car for another year, yeah, sure, poor aftermarkets, you have no choice if something broke. But if you are keeping it long, take care of it. Put the original stuff. They are expensive, I know, but they're worth it. I just thought I'd let you know that. Let's lower this car back down. Let's take a quick peek underneath it, because I love how these cars look on the inside, and this particular one is really in good shape. Let's look at the miles for this thing. This car only has 113,000 miles. Folks, in Toyota language, this is barely broken in. You'll easily see these cars with over 200,000-300,000 miles, and they ride like new. Rust is the only thing that kills these cars. And then, would you look at this interior? I mean, these interiors hold up so well. It's unbelievable. This is Toyota quality at its best, at its absolute best. And the owner of this car really takes care of it. I mean, it looks like nobody's ever sat in these seats. The back seats look new, the carpet looks new, everything is so clean and taken care of. This is always a joy to find one of these cars that are old and is in good shape, because these truly are worth preserving and keeping. They really last. It's just from the way, and listen to this door. It just sounds like a tank. Beautiful thing. One thing common with these, if you own one, whenever you see a Toyota handle like this, be gentle with it. Most people tend to pull the door. Just open it and pull the door when they get older, because these are notorious to break these handles. This is such a beautiful car, folks. It's such a great shape, and I am glad that the owner decided, let's go OEM parts, let's get things back to the right way, right how it should be. One more thing I want to tell you about these cars, and this actually applies to all Toyotas, almost all of them. If you look at the strut mount from far away, you will see these dots. Most people assume, well, you see these dots all over Toyotas. They're just dots, you know? Nothing to them. Nothing really to them. But the reality is, these are markers. In certain models, these dots have to face outside for the mount to be in the right orientation. In certain models, they face inside. You gotta watch where these go. I see so many people install them backwards, and initially you won't have a problem, but actually the way the car handles and drives will be completely different. So always watch for these markings, especially with the OEM parts. Aftermarket, yeah, let's hope they've installed them right, because they have nothing. But the originals, always watch for this stuff. It's the little details that make this car drive the way it is or doesn't. And this is another thing. The last issue we have with this car, which is one of another phantom problem. Occasionally, the car wouldn't idle. It just stumbles and dies. If you rev it up, it'll run fine. If you drive it, it'll run fine. But as soon as you let it go to idle, it just dies. Something with these did not have electronic throttle. These just had good old cable. So what happens with these is there is an idle air control motor underneath the throttle body. It gets gummed up and occasionally sticks. You can clean them. You don't have to remove them out of the car. Just shoot some cleaner in them, let them sit for a while, run the car, rev it up, it'll smoke a little bit, and life is good. In the case that that doesn't take care of it, do not, under whatever circumstance, adjust the screws for the idle. You will have so many problems with these the minute you adjust the idle, and you will never be able to get it right until you get it back exactly where it was. I see this mistake so many times, and it'll fix your problem. But then you'll have erratic idle. All of a sudden the car will rev up to 2,000 on its own. Do not adjust this rest stop, and by that I mean this screw right here, where the throttle stops. It's very easy for you to tighten this, and now the throttle is open more, and now you don't have any problems. But that's not correct, folks. Be careful with this. This is a mistake I see a lot of people do, and it's wrong. Do not do that, because you're going to have introduced so many problems. You'll never find the end until you bring it back to where it was. Another common issue with these, EGR. EGR on the 4-cylinder, we're talking about the 4-cylinder here, not the V6. For the most part, it's problem-free. It has one notorious problem. You'll have a code for EGR, insufficient flow. There is a valve, a vacuum valve, and they decided, maybe this was a Japanese joke, they put it right underneath the intake manifold, and you barely can get to it. It's so difficult to replace because you're literally cramped up like this underneath the car trying to get to it, to disconnect it and undo the bolt that holds it. It's unbelievable and it's unnecessary to be there. I don't know why they put it there, but that's one valve that is notorious. It's right underneath the intake manifold. Super common on these to just stop working. It's in such a high heat area that it just stops working, and you have all kinds of EGR problems. Very, very rare that the diaphragm itself goes out, but it's possible at this age. But the first thing you check is that valve. Is it working? Is it holding air? Usually one or the other, and that's your problem with EGR. Otherwise, these engines are great. This engine also had one teeny tiny disaster problem. Some of these, and this for some reason applies to 2000 and 2001, basically the facelift model, and the 5S engine. From the factory, some rod bolts were not tightened to specification. It's totally random. There's no rear VIN range. Not a lot of people talk about this. You basically be driving this car, runs perfectly smooth, you can't even hear this engine, and all of a sudden it just blows up for no reason. Usually the common place where it blows up right behind the compressor, and it damages the compressor as well. Just puts a big hole in the block and destroys the compressor as well. So here is something you might want to do, and I see this scenario in this exact order. An elderly couple used to own this car since new. It has 50,000 miles. They probably never revved it past 3,000 RPM. Never really put enough load on this rod bolt to come completely apart and disintegrate. You get the car, you stomp on it the first time on the highway, it blows up. People wonder, what just happened? All you have to do is pull the oil pan, pull the balance shaft, torque the rod bolts. You don't have to pull the engine out, just torque them. And sometimes when we've done this, you pull the oil pan, you'll see a bolt or two from the rods. That's how bad these get, folks. This is something you might want to do if you're buying a low mile example. It could save this engine, which otherwise would run forever, literally, with good maintenance. Folks, I hope this video was helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some other videos. And until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have yourself a wonderful day.